What happens when the pastor who preaches miracles no longer believes in prayer, and then sees a woman in white glowing beside him? He preached about miracles every Sunday, but in the quiet of Central Park, Pastor John Miller whispered the truth. "I feel nothing anymore." That's when she appeared. To his New York congregation, Pastor John was a beacon of hope, the kind of man who smiled warmly, quoted scripture with conviction, and held trembling hands at hospital bedsides. His voice could fill the sanctuary with thunder or drop to a whisper that made grown men weep. For 15 years, he'd been their shepherd, their rock, their proof that God still moved in Manhattan. But behind closed doors, the fire was gone. The change had been gradual, like watching paint fade in sunlight. First came the sleepless nights, staring at the ceiling while his wife Sarah breathed peacefully beside him. Then the sermons that felt hollow in his mouth, words he'd spoken 1,000 times suddenly tasting like ash. His prayers became mechanical recitations, performed for an audience of one who seemed to have stopped listening. "Why them, Lord?" he would whisper in his empty study, surrounded by commentaries and concordances that no longer brought comfort. Why are their prayers answered while mine fade like breath on glass? Mrs. Henderson's cancer had vanished overnight. The doctors called it unprecedented. Tommy Rodriguez walked again after the car accident that should have left him paralyzed. The congregation saw miracles everywhere, attributing each one to Pastor John's powerful intercession. If only they knew the truth. John's wife noticed the vacant eyes first. Sarah had loved him for 23 years, through seminary poverty and late-night hospital calls, through the birth of their twins and the loss of his mother. She could read his moods like sheet music. "You're disappearing," she told him one evening, her hand finding his across the dinner table. "Even when you're here, you're not really here." Their children felt his absence too. 16-year-old Emma had stopped asking him to bless her tests. 14-year-old David no longer brought his fears to his father's study. They sensed what John couldn't admit. The man who taught others to have faith had lost his own. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. Margaret Winters, 93 and sharp as winter wind, had clutched his hands after service. "Pastor, I've been praying for 30 years for my grandson to come home. He's been on the streets, drugs, but I feel it in my spirit. This is the week. Will you pray with me?" John had nodded, spoken the right words, felt the familiar weight of expectation. That afternoon, Margaret's grandson called, clean for 6 months, wanting to reconcile, coming home for Christmas. Another miracle, another answered prayer, another reminder that God moved for everyone except the man who stood in his pulpit. That night, John lay awake until 3 a.m., his soul screaming questions into the darkness. Why could he pray for others and see mountains move, but his own heart remained stone? Why did faith flow through him like water through a broken pipe, healing others while leaving him empty? On the outside, he was steady, but inside, the shepherd was lost. 3 weeks later, on a December night that bit with unusual cold, John left his house after everyone was asleep. He told himself he needed air, needed to think, needed to walk off the suffocating weight of pretending. But deep down, he knew where his feet were taking him. The bench in Central Park had become his secret confessional, the place where masks could fall. It sat beneath an old oak tree, far enough from the main paths that joggers and dog walkers rarely passed. Here, in the anonymous darkness, he could finally stop performing. He buried his face in his hands, breath misting in the frigid air. "I can't do this anymore." The words came out broken, barely audible. For the first time in 47 years, Pastor John Miller, the man who'd baptized hundreds, married dozens, buried too many to count, admitted what terrified him most. He felt utterly, completely alone. "I preach about mountains, God, but I can't move a pebble. They look to me for hope, and I'm drowning in doubt. If you're there," his voice cracked, "if you're listening, I need to know, because I can't fake this anymore." The park was silent except for distant traffic and the whisper of wind through bare branches. No voice from heaven, no burning bush, no pillar of fire. Just a broken man on a cold bench, finally honest about the emptiness that had been eating him alive. That's when the light began. At first, John thought it was a street lamp malfunctioning, casting strange shadows through the winter mist. But the glow was different, warmer, softer, alive in a way that electric light could never be. It seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, like moonlight made visible. He lifted his head, blinking away tears, and froze. A woman sat beside him on the bench. She hadn't been there moments before. John was certain of that. He'd chosen this spot precisely because it was empty, isolated. Yet there she was, as if she'd always been waiting. She appeared to be in her 30s, with dark hair that seemed to catch the mysterious light and eyes that held the depth of oceans. Her clothes were simple, a blue dress, a white veil, but they seemed to shimmer with an inner radiance that had nothing to do with fabric or thread. Most unsettling of all, she was completely at peace. "You're tired, John," she said, her voice carrying the gentleness of a mother soothing a frightened child. John's mouth moved soundlessly. He wanted to ask who she was, how she knew his name, where she'd come from, but the words wouldn't form. Her presence filled him with a sensation he'd almost forgotten. Awe mixed with comfort, mystery wrapped in love. "You've been carrying everyone's pain," she continued, turning to face him fully. The light seemed to intensify around her, not harsh like a spotlight, but soft like candlelight in a cathedral. "But who carries yours?" "I don't—" John's voice came out as a whisper. "I don't understand." She smiled, and John felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the knot that had been tightening for months. "You think faith means never doubting. You think being a shepherd means never being lost. But even Moses struck the rock in anger. Even David cried out in the darkness. Even my son asked why he'd been forsaken." "Your son?" The woman reached out and touched John's hand. Her skin was warm despite the freezing air, and at her touch, a wave of indescribable peace washed over him. It wasn't the absence of pain, but something deeper. The presence of perfect love, the kind of love that could hold pain and transform it. "I am Mary," she said simply, "and I know what it's like to watch someone you love suffer, to wonder if God hears your prayers, to hold on to faith when everything feels dark." John stared at her, his mind reeling. This was impossible. Hallucination brought on by exhaustion, stress, the breakdown he'd been careening toward for months. People didn't see the Virgin Mary on park benches in Manhattan, especially not pastors who'd lost their faith. But the peace radiating from her presence felt more real than anything he'd experienced in years. "You're not real," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "This isn't happening." Mary's expression didn't change, though her eyes held infinite compassion. "What makes something real, John? Is love less real because you can't measure it? Is hope less true because you can't hold it in your hands?" She gestured toward the park around them, where the mysterious light had transformed the winter landscape into something ethereal. Ice crystals on nearby trees caught the glow like scattered diamonds. The air itself seemed to hum with presence. "You've spent so long trying to be the answer for others that you forgot you're allowed to have questions. You've been so afraid of being weak that you've forgotten strength comes from admitting your need." John felt tears threatening again, but these were different from the bitter tears of despair he'd been shedding. These carried something else: relief, recognition, the overwhelming sensation of being truly seen. "But the congregation, they depend on me. If they knew how empty I feel, how often I question everything." "Do you think they love you for your certainty or for your heart?" Mary asked. "Do you think God called you to be perfect or to be faithful?" The question hung in the air between them, challenging everything John had believed about his role, his calling, his worth. "I don't know how to lead them if I don't have all the answers," he admitted. "Then lead them to the one who does." Mary stood gracefully, the light moving with her like a gentle aurora. She walked a few steps toward the oak tree, her hand trailing along its rough bark with the tenderness of someone greeting an old friend. "This tree," she said, "has weathered storms, droughts, harsh winters. Its roots run deep, finding water even in dry seasons. But it doesn't grow stronger by pretending the storms don't come. It grows stronger by bending without breaking. John watched her, still struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. Everything about this moment defied logic, yet felt more authentic than anything he'd experienced in his 15 years of ministry. "You think your congregation needs a pastor who never doubts," Mary continued, turning back to face him. "But what they really need is a pastor who knows what doubt feels like and can show them how to find God in the midst of it. How can I show them something I haven't found myself?" "Haven't you?" She moved back to the bench, settling beside him again. "John, think about Mrs. Henderson. When you prayed for her healing, what did you feel?" John closed his eyes, remembering that awful day in the oncology ward. Margaret Henderson, only 54, had looked so small in the hospital bed. Her husband clutched John's sleeve like a drowning man reaching for a life preserver. "I felt desperate," John said slowly. "Scared. Angry that cancer exists at all. But I prayed anyway because what else could I do? They needed hope, even if mine was hanging by a thread. And she was healed." The memory still amazed him. "Complete remission. The doctors couldn't explain it." Mary nodded. "You think faith means feeling certain. But that day, you had something far more precious. You had love. Love that prayed despite doubt. Love that stood in the gap when you couldn't stand for yourself. That wasn't emptiness, John. That was the deepest kind of faith." The revelation hit him like physical force. All this time, he'd been measuring faith by his feelings, his certainty, his ability to summon the right spiritual emotions. But maybe faith wasn't about having all the answers. Maybe it was about showing up anyway, loving anyway, hoping anyway, especially when everything inside screamed against it. "But the emptiness," he protested, "the silence when I pray for myself, is not abandonment," Mary said gently. "Sometimes God's greatest gift is teaching us to love without the reward of feeling His presence. Sometimes He calls us to serve from empty wells, trusting that He will provide the water." She stood again, and John noticed that her feet didn't quite touch the ground. The impossible nature of this encounter struck him anew. Not just who she was, but that she was here at all, speaking words his soul desperately needed to hear. "You've been fighting the wrong battle," she said. "You've been fighting to feel faith instead of learning to live faith. You've been trying to be God's answer instead of His faithful question. I don't understand. Every prayer you've prayed for others, that was faith. Every time you've shown up to preach despite feeling empty, that was faith. Every moment you've chosen love over cynicism, that was faith. Faith isn't the absence of doubt, John. Faith is loving God and His people in the presence of doubt." The light around them began to intensify, and John felt something shifting deep in his spirit. Not the return of easy belief, but something better. The recognition that his struggle hadn't been a sign of failure, but of depth. His questions hadn't been evidence of weak faith, but of a faith strong enough to wrestle with truth. "What am I supposed to do with this?" he asked. "How do I go back to them, knowing what I've seen?" Mary smiled, and in that smile, John saw the face of every mother who'd ever comforted a hurting child. Every woman who'd ever stood at the foot of a cross and refused to abandon love despite unbearable pain. "You don't go back the same," she said. "You go back better. You tell them the truth. That doubt isn't the enemy of faith, but its companion. That questions aren't sins, but invitations to go deeper. That God is big enough to handle their uncertainty and patient enough to love them through it." The light began to fade gradually, like dawn in reverse, but Mary remained solid, present, real, in a way that made the rest of the world seem like shadows. "Will you believe now?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. John considered the question carefully. Something had certainly shifted inside him, but it wasn't the return of easy certainty he'd been desperately seeking. Instead, it was deeper. A recognition that his journey through doubt hadn't been a detour from faith, but a necessary path toward a more mature understanding of it. "I believe," he said slowly, that love is real, that showing up matters, that questions can be prayers too. He paused, looking into her eyes. I believe that even when I can't feel God, He's still there. And I believe that maybe that's enough to start with. Mary nodded approvingly. Faith isn't a feeling, John. It's a choice. A daily choice to love, to serve, to hope, especially when those things are hard. She reached into the folds of her dress and withdrew something small and luminous, a single white rose that seemed to glow with inner light. The petals looked like they'd been carved from moonbeams, and its fragrance carried the scent of every garden that had ever bloomed. For your congregation, she said, offering it to him. Not as proof of what you've seen, but as a reminder of what you've learned. Faith blooms even in winter, John, especially in winter. John took the rose with trembling hands. It felt substantial, real, though it pulsed with the same gentle light that surrounded Mary. As his fingers closed around the stem, he felt a surge of something he'd almost forgotten. Not the manufactured enthusiasm he'd been trying to summon in recent months, but genuine hope. Quiet, steady, unshakable hope. What if they don't believe me? He asked. What if they do? Mary countered. What if they've been waiting their whole lives for someone to tell them it's okay to have questions? What if they need to hear that God loves their doubts as much as their declarations? John thought about his congregation, really thought about them. Margaret Winters, who'd whispered her fears about not being worthy of her grandson's healing. Tom Nakamura, who'd struggled with depression despite his deep faith. Elena Vasquez, who'd questioned God's goodness after her husband's sudden death. How many of them were sitting in their own dark nights, afraid to admit their struggles to the man they saw as spiritually unshakable? You think your congregation needs a pastor who never doubts, Mary had said. The truth of it pierced him now. They didn't need his perfection. They needed his honesty. They needed someone who could say, I've walked through the valley too, and I can show you there's light on the other side. I'm scared, John admitted. Good, Mary said, rising from the bench one final time. Fear means you understand the weight of what you're carrying. But don't let fear become an excuse for hiding. Your people need your courage, John, not your certainty. The light around her intensified until John had to shield his eyes. When he looked again, the bench was empty except for himself and the impossible rose in his hands. But the peace remained. Deep, unshakable, transformative peace. John stood in his study the following Sunday morning, the white rose resting on his desk in a simple glass of water. It hadn't wilted, hadn't lost its glow. If anything, it seemed more radiant in the morning light streaming through his office window. His sermon notes lay scattered across the desk. 3 different versions he'd started and abandoned. How do you explain the inexplicable? How do you share a miracle without sounding delusional? How do you tell people that their pastor nearly lost his faith completely, only to have it restored by an encounter that defied every natural law? Sarah knocked and entered with his usual pre-service coffee. She stopped short when she saw the rose. John, where did you get that? It's beautiful, but it's December. Roses don't bloom in winter, and I've never seen one that glows like that. John looked at his wife, this woman who'd stood by him through everything, who'd watched him struggle and never lost faith in him, even when he'd lost faith in everything else. If anyone deserved the truth, it was Sarah. I met someone in Central Park 3 nights ago, he said carefully. Someone who helped me understand that doubt doesn't disqualify you from faith. It deepens it. Sarah set down the coffee and moved closer, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. John, what happened? You've been different since that night. Not worse different, but I don't know how to describe it. Lighter somehow. I know how it sounds, John said, but I believe I encountered Mary, the Virgin Mary. She helped me see that I've been fighting the wrong battle, trying to feel faith instead of live it. He braced himself for skepticism, for the gentle suggestion that he might need professional help. Instead, Sarah surprised him. That rose, she said quietly. It's not natural, is it? There's something otherworldly about it. Yes. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying both the rose and her husband's face. Finally, she smiled. The first genuine smile he'd seen from her in months. "You know what? I don't care if it sounds impossible. You've been lost for months, John. Whoever or whatever brought you back, I'm grateful." The sanctuary was fuller than usual that morning. Word had somehow spread that Pastor John had something important to share, though John couldn't remember telling anyone that. Margaret Winters sat in her usual spot in the third pew, flanked by a young man John didn't recognize. Lean, nervous, with eyes that had seen too much. Her grandson, John realized. Another miracle, another answered prayer. As John walked to the pulpit, he carried the rose with him. Murmurs rippled through the congregation, not just at the unusual sight of a glowing flower in December, but at something different in their pastor's demeanor. He looked authentic in a way he hadn't in months. "Good morning," John began, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "I want to tell you about doubt." The sanctuary went dead silent. This wasn't how Pastor John usually started his sermons. 3 nights ago, I sat on a bench in Central Park and told God I didn't believe anymore. I told him I felt empty, abandoned, like a fraud standing in this pulpit every week pretending to have faith I couldn't feel. Gasps echoed through the pews. John saw shock, confusion, even disappointment on some faces. But on others, Margaret Winters, Tom Nakamura, Elena Vasquez, he saw recognition, relief. The desperate gratitude of people who'd been drowning in silence, finally seeing someone else surface for air. "I thought faith meant having all the answers," John continued, setting the rose on the pulpit where everyone could see its impossible glow. "I thought being your pastor meant never questioning, never struggling, never feeling the weight of uncertainty." He paused, looking out at the faces he'd served for 15 years. People he'd baptized, married, buried, counseled through their darkest moments. People he'd hidden his own darkness from, thinking he was protecting them. "I was wrong." "Faith isn't the absence of doubt," John said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "It's choosing love in the presence of doubt. It's showing up for each other when showing up is the last thing you feel like doing. It's praying for healing even when you're not sure anyone's listening. Because love compels us to hope anyway." He lifted the rose, and its light seemed to pulse in response to his words. 3 nights ago, when I'd given up completely, I received a gift. Not an answer to all my questions, but something better. The understanding that questions aren't the enemy of faith. They're faith's deepest expression. Margaret Winters was crying openly now, her weathered hands clasped around her grandson's tattooed ones. Tom Nakamura leaned forward, hanging on every word. Throughout the sanctuary, John saw the unmistakable signs of people recognizing their own stories in his confession. "This rose," John said, holding it higher, "bloomed in December. It glows with light that has no source. It defies every natural law we know. And it was given to me not as proof that miracles exist, but as a reminder that love exists, even when, especially when, we can't feel it." An elderly man in the back row raised a trembling hand. Robert Chen, a retired professor who'd joined the church 6 months ago but rarely spoke. "Pastor, are you saying it's okay to doubt? To question?" John smiled, and for the first time in months, it felt completely genuine. "Robert, I'm saying that if you're not questioning, you're not thinking deeply enough. God gave us minds capable of wonder and doubt, because both drive us toward truth. The person who never questions their faith has either found perfect understanding, which I doubt, or has stopped growing, which is tragic." "But what about certainty?" called out Jessica Martinez, a young mother whose faith had always seemed unshakable. "Don't we need to be sure about what we believe?" "Jessica, let me ask you this. When you tell your daughter you love her, do you wait until you feel completely certain about every aspect of love? Or do you say it because the love is real, even when your understanding of it is still growing?" Jessica's face lit with understanding. "I say it because it's true, even when it's bigger than I can explain." "Exactly." John set the rose back on the pulpit. "We don't love our families because we understand love perfectly. We love them because love compels us. even when it's mysterious. Faith works the same way. Elena Vasquez, who'd been silent since her husband's funeral 4 months ago, finally spoke. "Pastor, I've been angry at God." "Furious. Does that mean I've lost my faith?" John's heart broke for her. He remembered standing at Roberto Vasquez's graveside, watching Elena's face crumble as dirt hit the casket, feeling utterly inadequate to explain why good men die young while evil prospers. "Elena, anger at God isn't the opposite of faith. It's proof of faith. If you didn't believe he existed, who would you be angry at? If you didn't believe he was good, why would injustice hurt so much? Your anger tells me you still expect goodness, still demand justice, still believe love should triumph. That's not the absence of faith, Elena. That's faith crying out for fulfillment." Elena dissolved into tears. Not the bitter tears of despair, but the cleansing tears of someone who'd been given permission to feel everything she'd been suppressing. "So what do we do with our doubts?" asked David Kim, a college student home for Christmas break. "How do we live faith when we can't feel it?" John thought about his encounter with Mary, about the months of spiritual dryness that had led to that moment of breakdown and breakthrough. "We show up anyway," he said. "We love anyway. We serve anyway. We choose hope even when hope feels foolish. And we remember that faith isn't about us generating the right feelings. It's about us being willing to be channels for something bigger than ourselves." He picked up the rose again, marveling at its persistent glow. This flower shouldn't exist. It shouldn't bloom in December, shouldn't glow with inner light, shouldn't remain fresh without soil or roots. But here it is. And I've learned that sometimes the most powerful moments in our spiritual lives happen not when everything makes sense, but when we're willing to embrace mystery. The service that morning lasted nearly 2 hours, though no one seemed to notice. After John's confession and the appearance of the miraculous rose, something extraordinary happened. People began sharing their own struggles, their own questions, their own moments of doubt and breakthrough. Margaret Winters stood up, her voice shaking but determined. "I want to confess something too. I almost stopped believing when my grandson disappeared. I blamed myself, blamed God, blamed everyone. But I kept praying, not because I felt faithful, but because I didn't know what else to do with my love." Her grandson, Danny, squeezed her hand. "Grandma, it was those prayers that called me home. Even when I was too high to remember my own name, I could feel someone loving me, hoping for me. I didn't know it was you until last week, but I felt it." Tom Nakamura was next. The successful businessman everyone admired for his steady faith revealed his 3-year battle with depression, his wife's patience through his dark nights, his discovery that medication wasn't a failure of faith, but a tool for healing. Elena Vasquez shared her anger at God for taking Roberto, her fear that she was raising their children alone, her slowly dawning understanding that grief was love persisting beyond death. One by one, the carefully maintained facade of perfect faith began cracking open, revealing the beautiful, messy, complicated reality of real human beings wrestling with divine mystery. Sarah watched from the front pew, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed her husband's transformation. Not back to the man he'd been, but forward to the man he was becoming. Someone comfortable with questions, honest about struggles, real in a way that made space for others to be real too. The rose continued to glow throughout the service, its light seeming to intensify each time someone shared their truth. By the end of the morning, it felt less like a sermon and more like a family finally learning to tell each other the truth. As people lingered after service, unusual for a congregation that typically rushed home, John found himself surrounded not by people seeking answers, but by people grateful to share questions. The burden he'd carried alone for months suddenly felt lighter, distributed among dozens of willing hearts. "Pastor," said Jennifer Walsh, a nurse who'd never spoken about her work before, "I see so much suffering at the hospital. Sometimes I wonder if prayer makes any difference, or if I'm just talking to the ceiling." "Jenny," John replied, "the fact that you still pray despite seeing so much pain, that's not weakness, that's heroic. You're choosing hope in the face of evidence that could justify despair. If that's not faith, I don't know what is." "But what about when my prayers don't seem to work? When people die anyway?" John thought about Mary's words, about the difference between faith as feeling and faith as action. Maybe our prayers work in ways we can't see. Maybe you're praying for strength for a family facing loss. Maybe that prayer becomes real in your compassionate presence. Maybe you praying for healing becomes real in your gentle touch, your kind words, your willingness to sit with suffering. You think we become the answers to our own prayers? Sometimes. And sometimes the answer is just that we don't have to carry the pain alone. Over the following weeks, Riverside Community Church transformed, not into a place where doubt was eliminated, but into a place where doubt was welcome, where questions could coexist with worship, where uncertainty could walk hand in hand with hope. John's sermons changed too, gone were the neat three-point messages that tied everything up with theological bows. Instead, he preached about wrestling with God like Jacob, about the Psalms of Lament that made up 1/3 of the biblical songbook, about Jesus himself crying out in abandonment from the cross. The rose remained on the pulpit each Sunday, its inexplicable glow serving as a quiet reminder that mystery and faith were not enemies, but dance partners. New people began attending, drawn not by promises of easy answers, but by the rare offer of honest community. Word spread through Manhattan about the church where the pastor had admitted his doubts and found them transformed into something deeper than certainty. Sarah noticed the change in John immediately. He was present again, not perfect, not without questions, but genuinely there. He played with their children without distraction, listened to her concerns without trying to fix everything, prayed with a humility that came from knowing he didn't have all the answers. "You know what I realized?" Sarah told him one evening as they walked through their neighborhood, their breath misting in the cold air. "I fell in love with your heart, not your certainty. This version of you, the one who's honest about struggling, he's the man I married." Welcome back. Emma and David began bringing friends to church, drawn by the authenticity they sensed but couldn't quite name. For teenagers drowning in performance pressure and social media perfectionism, the message that questions were welcome felt revolutionary. But perhaps the most significant change was in John himself. The desperate seeking had been replaced by patient presence. He no longer measured his worth as a pastor by his ability to feel spiritual emotions, but by his willingness to love his people through their real struggles. The rose taught him something new each week. Sometimes it glowed brighter when he spoke about doubt. Sometimes its light seemed to pulse with the rhythm of communal prayer. Once, when 8-year-old Lily Stevens asked if it was okay to be mad at God for taking her grandpa, the rose practically blazed with light, as if even heaven approved of honest questions from grieving hearts. 6 months later, Pastor John Miller stood before his congregation holding a very different kind of sermon. The sanctuary was packed, not just with regular members, but with seekers drawn by stories of the church where doubt was treated as sacred ground. The rose, now permanently displayed in a place of honor, continued its impossible bloom. Local botanists had examined it, atheist professors had tested it, skeptics had tried to debunk it. None could explain its nature, but all agreed it defied conventional understanding. "Today, I want to talk about the ministry of questions," John began, "about how our uncertainties can become doorways to deeper faith, and how admitting we don't know everything might be the most honest thing we can do." In the third row, Margaret Winters sat with Danny, who'd now been clean for 8 months and had started volunteering at a homeless shelter. The answered prayer sat beside the woman who'd never stopped praying, both of them living proof that love persists through darkness. "I used to think my job was to give you answers," John continued, "but I've learned something important. My job is to love you through your questions, to sit with you in uncertainty, to remind you that not knowing isn't the same as being unknown." He gestured toward the rose. "This flower has taught me that some of the most beautiful things in life can't be explained, only experienced. Some of the most profound truths come not through understanding, but through wonder." A hand raised in the middle section. Dr. Patricia Santos, a quantum physicist who'd been attending for several months, smiled as she spoke. "Pastor, in my field, we've learned that uncertainty isn't a bug in the system. It's a feature. The most elegant equations describe probability, not certainty. Maybe faith works the same way. Explain that, John said, genuinely curious. Well, if faith meant certainty, if belief meant knowing everything in advance, then there'd be no room for growth, no space for surprise, no possibility for relationship. Uncertainty creates the space where love and trust and hope can flourish. An older man in the back nodded vigorously. Like marriage, he called out. 53 years ago, I promised to love Betty through whatever came next. I had no idea what that would mean. But the not knowing, that's what made the promise brave. Yes. John felt electricity in the air, the sensation of truth being discovered communally. Faith isn't about predicting the future or understanding everything about God. It's about trusting that love is real, that purpose exists, that we're not alone in this cosmic experiment called existence. So how do we live that? Asked Elena Vasquez. She'd been attending a grief support group and slowly rebuilding her understanding of God's presence in suffering. We practice resurrection daily, John replied. We choose hope when despair feels more reasonable. We extend grace when judgment feels more satisfying. We love when love seems foolish. And we remember that every small act of faith, yours, mine, ours together, contributes to the healing of the world. The story of the glowing rose and Pastor John's transformation couldn't be contained within the walls of Riverside Community Church. Local newspapers picked up the story, initially approaching it with skepticism, but finding themselves unable to debunk either the rose's existence or its impossible properties. Dr. Maria Gonzalez, a professor of religious studies at Columbia, came to investigate. She arrived as a scholar and left as a seeker. I've studied mystical experiences across cultures for 20 years, she told the congregation. I've seen people claim miracles and found natural explanations. But this is different. The flower itself is remarkable, but the transformation in this community, that's the real miracle. The church began receiving visitors from across the country. Not religious tourists seeking spectacle, but people hungry for honest faith. Pastors came to learn about leading with authenticity. Atheists came curious about the claimed miracle and stayed for the intellectual humility. Seekers came hoping to find a place where questions were treated as prayers. John started a weekly discussion group called Faith and Doubt, an hour every Wednesday evening where people could voice their deepest spiritual questions without fear of judgment. The group grew from 8 people to over 60 within 2 months. The goal isn't to eliminate doubt, John would tell newcomers. The goal is to hold doubt and faith in creative tension, letting our questions sharpen our understanding and our love deepen our commitment. Dr. Chen, the retired professor who'd asked about questioning, became a regular facilitator, bringing his academic rigor to bear on spiritual mysteries. In science, he often said, our best theories are the ones that generate the most interesting questions. Maybe faith works the same way. The ripple effects extended beyond the church walls. Danny Winters, Margaret's grandson, started a support group for people in recovery, using his grandmother's story of persistent prayer as an anchor point for hope. She never stopped believing I could come home, he'd tell newcomers, even when I'd stopped believing in myself. Elena Vasquez began volunteering at a hospice, discovering that her experience with grief had given her a unique ability to sit with others in their final journeys. She didn't offer platitudes or easy comfort, but something more valuable: the presence of someone who'd wrestled with loss and emerged not unscathed, but deeper. Tom Nakamura used his business platform to speak openly about mental health in the corporate world, challenging the stigma that equated depression with spiritual weakness. My faith didn't cure my depression, he'd tell startled executives, but it gave me the courage to seek help and the hope to believe healing was possible. Not everyone embraced the changes at Riverside Community Church. About 20 members left over the first 6 months, uncomfortable with John's new emphasis on uncertainty and questions. We come to church for answers, one departing family complained, not more confusion. John felt each departure keenly, but Mary's words echoed in his memory. You cannot be responsible for everyone's comfort, only for everyone's invitation to truth. Meanwhile, new faces appeared regularly. Dr. Jennifer Liu, a research scientist at Mount Sinai, started attending after her colleague mentioned the unusual intellectual honesty of the sermons. "I've spent my career working with uncertainty," she told John after one service. "It's refreshing to find a faith community that doesn't pretend to have figured everything out." Rabbi David Goldstein from the synagogue down the street began attending the Wednesday evening discussions, bringing Jewish perspectives on wrestling with God. "In our tradition," he shared one evening, "the name Israel literally means struggles with God. The struggle isn't a bug, it's the feature." Imam Ahmed Hassan joined the interfaith dialogue that naturally evolved from the discussion groups. In Islam, we have a concept called jihad al-nafs, the greater struggle, the internal wrestling with doubt and certainty. Perhaps all true faith requires this wrestling. The rose seemed to glow more brightly during these interfaith conversations, as if approving of the way different traditions could illuminate common truths about the spiritual journey. Dr. Stephen Marcus, a psychiatrist and avowed atheist, came initially to investigate what he suspected was mass delusion. He stayed for the community. "I don't believe in your rose," he told John honestly, "but I believe in what it's doing." People are more honest here, more vulnerable, more willing to face their real struggles. From a mental health perspective, that's extraordinary. "Maybe," John replied, "the miracle isn't in what you believe about the rose, but in what the rose helps us believe about each other." 1 year after Mary's appearance, John returned to the Central Park bench, not in desperation this time, but in gratitude and remembrance. The rose, now accompanied by small cuttings that somehow shared its glow, had become the centerpiece of a ministry that reached far beyond Sunday mornings. Sarah came with him, along with their children and about 40 members of the congregation who'd become family in the deepest sense of the word. They didn't come expecting another miraculous appearance, but to honor the space where transformation had begun. "This time last year," John said to the gathered group, "I sat on this bench convinced that my ministry was over, that my faith was dead, that I was a fraud leading people nowhere." He looked around at the faces illuminated by streetlights and the persistent glow from the roses they'd brought. Margaret and Danny Winters, now inseparable in their shared journey of healing. Elena Vasquez, whose grief had deepened into a profound ministry of presence with other widows. Tom Nakamura, whose openness about mental health had literally saved 3 lives in their congregation. "I thought God had abandoned me," John continued, "but I learned something that night that changed everything. God doesn't abandon us in our questions. He meets us there. Our doubts aren't failures of faith. They're invitations to deeper relationship." Emma, now 17 and considering seminary, despite her father's gentle warnings about the challenges of ministry, raised her hand. "Dad, can I ask you something that's been bothering me?" "Always." If doubt is so important to faith, does that mean people with simple, unquestioning belief are missing something? John smiled at his daughter's intellectual courage. "Emma, I think there are seasons of faith, just like seasons in nature. Sometimes we need the simple trust of a child, and that's beautiful. Sometimes we need the wrestling of a Jacob, and that's beautiful too. The danger comes when we insist that everyone should be in the same season we are." Dr. Liu, who'd become a close friend over the year, nodded thoughtfully. "In scientific research, we go through phases too. Sometimes we need the curiosity to ask new questions. Sometimes we need the patience to live with partial answers. Both phases serve the pursuit of truth." As the group prepared to leave, Danny Winters approached John privately. "Pastor, there's something I never told you about that first Sunday when Grandma brought me to church." "What's that?" "I was planning to kill myself that week. I'd been clean for 6 months, but the guilt was eating me alive. I figured God would never forgive me for what I'd put my family through." Danny's voice dropped to a whisper. "But when you talked about doubt being okay, about questions being prayers, it gave me permission to keep struggling instead of ending the struggle." John felt his breath catch. "Danny. That rose saved my life, Pastor. Not because it proved God exists. I already knew that somewhere deep down. But because it proved that God loves people like me. People who mess up. People who doubt. People who don't have their act together." As they walked home through the quiet streets of Manhattan, John reflected on the year's journey. The desperate pastor who'd collapsed on a park bench had died that December night. In his place had emerged someone more honest, more human, more useful to both God and his community. The rose still bloomed impossibly on his desk, still defied every natural law, still drew scientists and skeptics and seekers from around the world. But John had learned that the real miracle wasn't the flower itself. It was the permission it gave people to be authentically human in the presence of the divine. Divine, 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 divine.